Joining us now is CJ Werleman. He's live in Sydney, Australia. CJ is a columnist for Inside Arabia. That's my number one source of information for the Middle East. Go to InsideArabia.com. He is a terrorist and conflict analyst and journalist, and he is joining us now. Hey, CJ, great to have you.
Mate, always great to be talking with you, John. How are you tonight?
CJ, I'm doing fine. We're practicing social distancing here in the majority of America, so we're kind of on semi-lockdown where you can only go out for a prescription, something meaningful. You can go for a walk your dog, go to the store. That's about it. I want to get to an article you did in Inside Arabia. By the way, for our listeners, I'm a huge fan now of Inside Arabia. That's the site that I go to exclusively for updates and news on the Middle East, which I follow. Go to InsideArabia.com. You can sign up for their newsletter there, which comes out 2 times a month, and it's also based in D.C. CJ, you had an article up the other day that I read pretty thoroughly because I agree with it. Obviously, you get people on you agree with, and you said, have U.S. weapons turned the UAE, people that don't know what that is, of course, that's the United Emirates, into a little Frankenstein. I'm not a fan of Saudi. I'm not a fan of MbS, as you know. I think Saudi has been a fake ally of the U.S. forever. You look what they're doing to energy prices now. They're basically destroying the U.S.'s independent fracking natural gas and oil industry by moving the oil down to $19 a barrel. But UAE is worse, and I've always thought that MbZ is pulling all the strings there. But it's our weapons that are turning them into what you call a little Frankenstein. Can you elaborate on that?
They don't think of the de facto ruler of that Emirate state, Mohammed bin Zayed, or MbZ. He doesn't sort of come to mind, but he really is one of the most influential voices in Washington, D.C. He's arguably the world's richest man. He controls a wealth or a fortune that exceeds $1.3 trillion. He's one of the biggest procurers of U.S. weapons in the world, and he's armed to the teeth, and he's willing to use that military might. He was one of the chief architects of the war in Yemen, which has been described as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. His aim there was to control the southern part of the country to form basically a logistics chain all the way to the Horn of Africa. That's a disaster. He was part of the chief architects of the blockade against Qatar.
Right.
And this is where it brings us full circle to where we have he shares the ear of President Trump's inner circle, something he's cultivated very hard, but he also put together a program that effectively procured or recruited former NSA spies to work for the UAE to hack the phones of Americans, particularly American journalists, American human rights activists who are critical of the UAE, particularly their foreign policy. And this is something that came to light about 12 months ago. But it shows you the lengths that the UAE is to go to.
No, if they act counter to it. You look at what they did in Yemen. I mean, that's a complete disaster fighting the Houthis. They spent billions of dollars there. Half the time, they end up blowing up school buses and markets. That has been a complete disaster. Yep. That's number one. The blockade against Qatar, which they originally convinced the Trump administration to look the other way on, that from a humanitarian standpoint, stopping just a free flow of people in between these 4 countries, the Gang of Four, that's been horrible. It's also been a disaster because they've accomplished no objectives with that. The state of Qatar is financially and economically better off after the blockade than they were when it started. So that was like stupid. Yeah. And, now they're stuck with it. And let me just ask you something. You mentioned, look, I'm not a fan. They don't have to hack my phone because I get on the air and blast them. I could care less. But sure. when they hack phones of journalists critical of MbZ and the UAE and the relationship, what do they do with that information?
Well, what they do with that information ultimately led to the death of the Washington Post journalist and also a colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine at Middle East Eye. Jamal Khashoggi was hacked to death in the Saudi consulate in Turkey. But based on the UAE being a broker between an Israeli designed software company called the NSO Group, which designed a software called Pegasus, which enabled their clients to hack into the phones, trace their keystrokes, trace their passwords, trace their movements, and that's how they're ultimately able to trace the conversations between Khashoggi and another journalist / activist, and ultimately traced him, invited him to the Saudi consulate there, and had him murdered. So it's all about intimidating critics, intimidating journalists and human rights activists that speak out against what is one of the most repressive regimes in the world.
CJ, the other thing is they have an army of high-priced lobbyists running around Washington. Now, they all have to register as, helping a foreign government. We have a process for that. You live in Washington like I do during the week. MbZ has put together like an all-star cast of very high-priced lobbyists and lobbyist firms that do his bidding in both Congress and the White House. How has he been able to cobble that together?
So they get these their salaries are driven by these think tanks, and these think tanks are funded by these Sunni Arab Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So these think tanks are, they're supposed to act as independent, impartial givers of foreign policy advice and a reading of the world as it is. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they don't prescribe anything which runs counter to the strategic interests of either Saudi Arabia or the UAE. So they do have a very influential role. I mean, they're one of the key drivers of foreign policy. The Israeli lobby, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. Hard to find three more powerful foreign policy influences in Washington, D.C.
One question I wanted to ask is, why do you think the United Emirates are continuing to promote Islamophobia in the West? I mean, don't they fear that the spread of do they fear the spread of democracies in the Arab world? Do you think that their authority is threatened by these democracies?
So MbZ is obsessed with the Muslim Brotherhood, and as is Saudi Arabia, and that's why they went after Qatar, because obsessed with Iran as well. They went out after Qatar because they thought Qatar was becoming overly friendly with the Muslim Brotherhood and overly friendly with Iran, based on a false article only. But that's how they see the world. They see those as the two biggest threats to their rule, and therefore they go after them with, vendicious, veracity. And that's why they do align themselves actually with very far-right Islamophobic groups around the world, because pushing Islamophobia serves their agenda in the West, because it gets the West hostile to political Islam, which preserves their rule in their countries. I would agree with the assessment that MbS is far more reckless, but that's not to say that MbZ is not reckless either. I mean, MbZ has been involved in the same foreign policy disasters as MbS, so that they're really inextricably entwined together. And if you speak to, and I mean, you live in D.C. and the area, you speak to a lot of, influential people. I know when you have private conversations with anybody who's close to the foreign policy circles, they will tell you quite openly how fearful they are of MbS's rule in Saudi Arabia and the challenges that presents the United States going forward.
Well, it's a fake ally. What is MbZ's position on Libya, and how is that not in the best interests of the United States? Explain that, in your view.
Well, Libya has been a broken country, obviously, for the last several years. But there had been signs of, stability. Tripoli had been a stable city for the last couple of years, but now you have this warlord, General Khalifa Haftar, who he controls the Libyan National Army, but it's not really the Libyan National Army. That's just a pseudonym for a bunch of the most violent militias that have ever walked the African continent. I mean, some of these militias would embarrass ISIS with their cruelty and barbarity. And Haftar is actually destroying Libyan groups which rose up and opposed ISIS and defeated ISIS in that country. And now he's laid siege to the city of Tripoli. So now Tripoli is in its worst position it's been in a while. And this Haftar, we're opposed to Haftar. In fact, he's been sued in a U.S. court for war crimes, despite the fact he actually lived as a protected dissident in Virginia for a while. But he's a war criminal. The United States treats him as a war criminal. But the UAE and France and Egypt is arming him to the teeth. And at the moment, he has the city of Tripoli completely surrounded. It's a medieval-like siege. The suffering is harrowing, and it's one of the most underreported catastrophes which is going on in the world right now.
After this segment with us, C.J. Werleman, you can be sure that MbZ is going to be personally hacking your phone and your computer going forward.
I get phishing emails all the time.
We're out of time. Hey, we're on the public radio, and he could just go to the YouTube page this afternoon, and he wouldn't have to hack anything. It's all there. We want to thank C.J. Werleman for being with us. Now he's becoming a regular on the John Fredericks Radio Network. Go to InsideArabia.com, my source for news in the Middle East. That's where I go. Tag it, InsideArabia.com, based in D.C. CJ, thank you for being with us.